My name is Tim Worth, a member of the NEI board, and it's my privilege in this glittering building to introduce perhaps the most glittering and important leader today in the environmental movement. Bill McKibben wrote in 1989, The End of Nature, which was, for those of us engaged in the early parts of the climate battles, the first general purpose book on climate change, and it has become a basic reader for students all over the country for the last 25 years. He was the founder of the most important grassroots climate campaign in the country, 350.org. It's had 15,000 rallies since 2009, and Bill and his colleagues were, as you know, aggressively opposed to the Keystone Pipeline, surrounded the White House 5 deep in protest last fall, and in the kind of civil disobedience that Gus was talking about this afternoon, Bill had the cell next to Gus when they were arrested for the Keystone Pipeline demonstration. Bill McKibben is currently the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury. He was the editor of the Harvard Crimson, a writer for the New Yorker, and the author of a dozen books, many reflecting his own experiences in walking around the country and in trips around the world. Perhaps of greatest relevance to our discussions this weekend are 3 points. One, his 2007 book, Deep Economy, The Wealth of Communities and a Durable Future, describes the shortcomings of the growth economy and envisions a transition to a more local-scale enterprise. Second, his articulate call for a broad grassroots social and political movement built around the most sustainable, aggressive citizen action to combat climate change and radically transform our energy economy. 350.org has become exactly that, the world's largest grassroots climate movement, with activists in every country except North Korea. And third, he's been focused like a laser beam on the desperate need for the reform of our campaign finance system. Bill has written, this is fertile ground for action. After all, Congress's approval rating is now at 9%, which is another way of saying that everyone who's not a lobbyist hates them and what they're doing. The big boys are, of course, counting on us simmering down. They're counting on us being cynical. They're counting on us figuring out there's no hope or benefit in fighting City Hall. But if we're naive enough to demand a country more like the one we were promised in high school civics, then we have a shot. Bill McKibben.
What a pleasure to get to be here, I gotta say. Probably more my pleasure than yours. It always dawns on me, you know, on these occasions. Here we are in this incredibly beautiful building on the end of a kind of rain-washed, glorious summer day in the Hudson Valley, and we've been listening to stimulating talk and eating good local food, and I'm just kind of a professional bummer-outer of people. I mean, that's really my work in the world, and I feel particularly bad doing it today because this is such a great gathering of so many great minds. Just to look around dinner and realize that I knew half the people there, and every one of them were people whose work I just loved and respected so much. In particular, to get to share the stage with Susan is a great honor. She's been a friend for a long time, and I've gotten to watch her work develop. I've spoken several times for things, but by far my favorite occasion was when the millionth Berkshire went into circulation, and I went down to the Berkshires to give a talk, and you know, I knew that this was a good thing, but I figured it might, like some of these things, be sort of, you know, the kind of alternative currency that really only worked at the food co-op or the vegan massage parlor or, you know, whatever it was. And she gave me $50, I can't, a Norman Rockwell and a couple of W.E.B. Du Boises and things instead of I decided to put it to the test, and instead of going to the food co-op, I flagged down the Mr. Softy ice cream truck that was going through town, and without blinking an eye, I handed over my Norman Rockwell and got a couple of Herman Melvilles in change, and this thing is very real, and very good. So thank you so much for all that work. And the other reason that I'm just spectacularly happy to be here tonight is because really one of my favorite people in the whole world is kind of now running this enterprise, Bob Massey, who's taken over about 10 weeks ago at the head of things. If there is anyone on the planet who can catalyze this project and carry it forward, it's Bob. But, when you hired him, it was a particularly good idea because it really is one of those classic twofers, and his wife, Anne, who's here tonight, is also an enormous power in her own right, and I happen to know that it's their wedding anniversary today, so I just wanted to say happy anniversary to them. So, the work that y'all are about this weekend is so dear to my heart. It's been the place where my intellectual work, such as it's been in the last few years, the books I've written and things have largely been about this idea of a more localized and more sensible, more durable economy than the one we have at the moment. It's not only what I enjoy writing about, it's what I enjoy working with and doing with my neighbors in Vermont, where we've come as close to realizing parts of this as any place in the country. And it was a real pleasure just to be at this panel this afternoon with several of my fellow Vermonters, including your board member, Will Rapp, but also the state's Commissioner of Agriculture, Chuck Ross, and to hear them describe some of what's going on. It really is remarkable what's happened in the last 10 years. I wrote an article 8 or 9 years ago for Gourmet magazine, of all places, and I wrote it about an experiment that I undertook then that at the time I think almost nobody else had tried to undertake for a long time. I said, we're going to eat my family for a year just from food in the Champlain Valley, and it was good fun, and root vegetables a little predominant by about April, but it was great fun. But by now, it would be a complete cliche, There are nothing but locavores everywhere one turns, and now it's reached the critical mass where we can really begin to see it taking shape. Last year, the USDA announced that for the first time in 150 years, there were more farms in America instead of fewer. That's remarkable. The most powerful demographic trend in this country since the Civil War has bottomed out and begun to reverse, and it's because of the rise of this new economy as it relates to food, and you can see it happening in other places around the world, and you can see it happening with other commodities. I'm giving you all the good news here first. A week ago Saturday, the country of Germany generated more than half the electricity it used for the day with solar panels in that country. That's a remarkable accomplishment, and it's important to bear it in mind. One of the things it makes clear, and it's something I will return to, is that our challenge is not technological at this point. Our challenge is sociological and political. We know how to do what we need to do, we're just not doing it for the most part. But it is remarkable to see what we have begun to do in this area of local economies, and I'm absolutely certain that it will continue, not primarily because of its ecological worth or because of, it comes with many values. I said once that, the 5 Mile tomato is obviously ecologically superior to the 5,000-mile tomato, and it's clearly aesthetically, culinarily. I mean, I traveled so far this week about 5,000 miles. I know how I feel. That's how the tomato feels too, in the course of doing it. But the real reason it will prevail is because its local economy is a different social construct that appeals to who we actually are. The 60 or 70-year high consumer project to identify us as consumers, not as neighbors, not as people, but as consumers, has had many results, many of them pretty devastating ecologically, but also devastating in powerful ways socially. Having spent the last 50 years on the project of building bigger houses farther apart from each other, that's what our economy has mostly been about, it should not come as any great surprise that we're not as satisfied statistically with our lives as we were 50 years ago. The reason is that we have many, many fewer connections with each other. The average American has half as many close friends as the average American of 50 years ago. That is an enormous change for a socially evolved primate to undergo. There are not enough iPads in the world, wonderful though they are, to make up for those lost friendships. And so the real appeal of the local economy is not its ecological superiority, it's its social superiority. When sociologists followed shoppers around they followed them around, first around the supermarket and then around the farmer's market, taking notes discreetly, the way sociologists do. And you can guess what that, I mean, you've all been to the supermarkets, you know how it works. You walk in, you fall into a light fluorescent trance, you visit the Stations of the Cross around the supermarket, that's it, When they followed people around the farmer's market, they had on average 10 times more conversations per visit, okay? That's what we like. And that's why this idea will win out. It's who we are. The aberration is not the farmer's market. That's how all human beings have shopped for food for 10,000 years, and most of the world still does. The aberration was this short thing in between, and it hasn't worked very well. And so this virtuous cycle that people like Susan have helped inaugurate is going to carry the day, I think. But it faces one overwhelming obstacle, which will derail it and everything else unless we're able to bring it under control very, very quickly. And that is the remarkable degradation of the planet that is now intensely underway. I wrote the first book, as Senator Worth said, about climate change. I wrote it 23 years ago in 1989. And at the time, we knew what we needed to know, really, about climate change. We knew you burn coal, oil, and gas, you put carbon in the atmosphere, and we knew its molecular structure traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The only thing we did not know was how hard and how fast it was going to pinch. And the story of the last 20-some years is that it's pinching way harder and way faster than we ever would have guessed. We've only raised the temperature of the planet about 1 degree so far, but that's been enough to kick off almost unbelievable scale of change. The Arctic has 40% less ice in the summer than it did. If you hold up that first picture that came back from the Apollo missions of the Earth, it's as out of date as my high school yearbook picture. It does not look like that anymore. There's 40% less ice. You can't see it with the naked eye, but the ocean is 30% more acid as it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. The thing that we notice probably most of all on sort of terrestrial ground is what's happened to the planet's hydrology, the way that water moves around the Earth.
Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. If you want one fact to remember to understand the 21st century, that's it, okay? The atmosphere is about 4.5% moister than it was 40 years ago, which is a staggering change in a basic physical parameter of the planet. It's the surest sign that we've left the Holocene, this 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that underwrote the rise of civilization, and entered into something else. Because the atmosphere is wetter, the dice are loaded for drought and for flood, and that is what we see in every corner of the world. We did at 350 a big day of action a few weeks ago that we called Connect the Dots, and I know some of you helped. All over the world, people who'd already felt the sting of climate change, wherever they were, rallied to kind of try and put a human face on this problem and this crisis. And the pictures were beautiful and, as always, heartbreaking to look at. Peasants in India who sent us just a little note saying there's no water left behind our dam. Peasants in Pakistan, where 20 million people were kicked out of their homes by floods along the Indus in the last 2 years. People in Thailand, where the flooding in December was so severe that they think it did damage equivalent to 18% of the GDP of that country. People in my home state of Vermont, where we felt the sting of global warming in August when Hurricane Irene ambled up the East Coast and passed over record warm water off New York and New Jersey, picked up a huge freight of moisture and dumped it all on the Green Mountains. And it was staggering. I mean, we had bridges that had been there for 200 years, covered bridges, taking everything nature could throw at them, just wash away. That was the kind of anecdotal evidence about what was going on, and it was mirrored in the statistical evidence. We have 250 years of rainfall records in Vermont. That means we have 10,000 rainstorms, maybe. For those of you who can remember your statistics, that's a big N, a big sample size. So if you're going to break a record, it's going to be very rare that you'll break a record with that big pool. But if you're going to do it, it's going to come by a millimeter, We were breaking the old one-day rainfall records by 25 and 30%. 2 weeks later, Tropical Storm Katie came up the coast, and it wasn't even that big a storm, but it veered inland a little further over New York. It dumped its water up around Broome County and Binghamton. They broke their old one-day rainfall record by 60%. Statistically, that shouldn't be possible, except that rain is falling on a different planet than those old records were set on. That's why I called my most recent book with this odd title, Earth, but spelled wrong, E-double-A-R-T-H. You kind of have to channel your inner Schwarzenegger to pronounce it correct, sort of Earth. It's a different place. I mean, same number of continents, gravity still works, but it is a fundamentally already altered planet. And we're just at the beginning. We've raised the temperature 1 degree, but the same scientists who told us that that would happen and told us what it would entail now tell us without any reservation that if we don't get off coal and oil and gas far faster than any government plans to at the moment, that rise will be 4 or 5 degrees before the century is out, most of it locked in the next little while, and there is no reason to think that civilizations can even begin to cope with that. Already, it's hard. Already it's hard even for those wonderful, durable, local economies that we're trying to build. And boy, did that come home to us in Vermont in August and September during Hurricane Irene. Because we lost a lot of bridges and things, but you know what else we lost a lot of? Are those beautiful organic farms that people had spent 15, 20 years building up, and all of a sudden that rich soil, a lot of it along the river bottoms, was overtopped by a foot of sand from the rivers, The Intervale up in Burlington, our great showpiece of local agriculture, the battery for much of the agricultural development in the state of Vermont, this 120-acre plot in the middle of Burlington that's divided up into 10 farms and where young farmers come and serve apprenticeships and learn their trade. Well, it's the most beautiful place, and it supplies 7, 8, 9% of the fresh food that Burlington eats in a year. But not last year, because the whole thing was underwater. They didn't harvest anything last fall. We can't, in other words, rescue ourselves by doing the right things at home alone. I kind of wish we could, because I would, given my druthers, like to stay home in Vermont and work on that. It's the most fun, but I'm hardly ever home. I'm now out around all the time, because if we do not take care of this large global crisis, we won't be able to realize that future that otherwise is coming, the one to which we are all working. Those two problems, or those two possibilities, are always fixed in my mind, and trying to figure out how we avoid the one and get to the other. That's the trick. And here's the good news. The good news is that the most of what we need to do, some of the most important things we need to do to deal with global warming, will also help this transition enormously. If we could do one thing above all else to deal with climate change, it would be to put a price on carbon that reflects the damage it does in the atmosphere. It would be to end the special exemption that the fossil fuel industry alone among industries enjoys, the right to pour its waste into the atmosphere for free. Nobody else can do that. If you own a restaurant, okay, the cheapest thing for you to do, I saw Judy Wicks here someplace, I mean, the cheapest thing to do would be to just take all your garbage at the end of the night and toss it out into the middle of the street, you know. Your profits would go up because you wouldn't have to pay someone to cart it away. But if you did that, within a week, there'd be rats all over the place, and you'd be dealing with leptospirosis or whatever. So we don't let people do that. We haven't for 100 or 200 years. We've said you have to clean up after yourselves. The exception is the fossil fuel industry, which is allowed to pour the most dangerous thing on Earth, carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere free of charge. If we put a price on that, we would quickly start realizing the incredibly false economies in which we live, and the changes would be remarkable. For instance, industrial agriculture is entirely dependent on cheap fossil fuel, and the day that it's not available in its current quantities is the day that we have all kinds of people in all kinds of places who had never much thought about being a locavore, who will suddenly decide that this is in fact a terrific idea and find out what a terrific idea it is. Build those kind of local, beautiful food economies. It's the day when we'll take all sorts of steps in the right direction. It's not hard to do. Every economist has been recommending that we do it for a very long time, but we're not doing it. We're not doing it. We're not taking those steps. With the few exceptions like Germany, the world careens down this path of ever greater fossil fuel use and ever greater carbon emissions and ever growing temperatures. And so we got to figure out how we win that fight that we're losing. Copenhagen and the climate summit was a disaster. Rio in a few weeks will be a similar disaster. Nothing useful will come out of it, and we can't afford any more of these. We have to very quickly turn this tide. So it's very important to answer the question of why they've been disasters, what the force is that's holding us back. And there are many parts to that answer, and we can think of a lot of them, you know. Some of them are rooted in just plain inertia, and some in human psychology. We're better at recognizing immediate threats than things that take a few years and so on. Those are true, but they're not the central part of the problem. The central part of the problem, the central obstacle, is the incredible grip of the fossil fuel industry on the reins of power here and around the world. Okay? This is the most profitable industry that human beings have ever concocted. It is the exact opposite of everything that NEI is about. It is about the concentration of resources and wealth in a very few hands. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money. Okay. And in our system and in other systems, that gives them an enormous amount of political power, which they have used systematically, all the fossil fuel industry, to prevent and delay and stall action. Senator Wirth, I think, would concur that the easiest thing to do in our system is to prevent things from happening, to stall and delay and block them, and they have been masters at that. We spent a long time thinking that the answer was going to be that we would just talk reasonably and wisely to our leaders, have scientists huddle with them and explain that the greatest problem the world had ever faced was coming at us, and that they would then act wisely and responsibly. And a few of them did, but for the most part it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work was because we did not figure out that simultaneously the fossil fuel industry would be bellowing this toxic mix of threats and promises in the other ear, and drowning out science and drowning out the kind of appeal to the future that we need. Their business model is the problem. They are committed to burning. They already have in their reserves far more carbon than any scientist thinks is safe for us to burn. And so, either we're going to do something that harms that business model, or we're going to do something that wrecks the planet. Those are the two possibilities. Now, the day will come when we put a price on energy that suddenly Exxon and all the rest will figure out that they can transform themselves from fossil fuel companies to energy companies, and help with the process of putting up solar panels and windmills. But they will not do it voluntarily because they are making so much money where they are now. And so we need to figure out how to surmount that power. How to surmount the power of the Koch brothers, the great third and fourth richest men in the world, fossil fuel barons, or how to supplant the power of all their brethren all around the world. My guess is we are never going to have enough money to match them dollar for dollar. You look like a very prosperous and well-heeled bunch, but my estimation is even if we pooled all our money, we would still come up slightly short of Exxon. Okay? And so that better not be the currency that we try to fight in. We better find some other currencies. Passion and spirit and creativity, the currency of movements. Movements are what I want to talk about here at the end of this talk, about building movements, because this climate movement is incredibly important, and along with it, we need to build and spread this movement that NEI represents, And so I want to talk a little bit about how maybe to, and as I do not mistake me for an expert in these realms, okay? I'm not. Being an activist was not what I had planned to do with my life. I am a writer by trade, which means, almost by definition, someone with limited ability at this kind of thing. Writer, it's not, you're very nice, and I enjoy being here with you, but I'd really rather be home typing, That's what I was sort of bred to do, and so it's been an adventure to try and figure out how to form some kind of movement. I'll just tell you a couple of stories about sort of how we went about it, just to give you a little sense. I'd come back from Bangladesh, where Bangladesh was in the grips of its first big outbreak of dengue fever, which is a bad mosquito-borne disease that's spreading like wildfire around Asia and South America, because mosquitoes really like the warm, wet world that we're building on their behalf. I mean, if you were looking at our planet through a telescope trying to figure out why we were changing the atmosphere, a reasonable guess would be that we had embarked on a planet-scale mosquito ranching enterprise, and this was the most efficient way in which to do it. There were a lot of people dying in Bangladesh from this dengue They were freaked out because it hadn't happened before. Big pictures of the mosquitoes on the front page of the paper. Well, I spent a lot of time in the slums, so eventually I got bit by the wrong mosquito, and I was as sick as I'd ever been. But of course, I was strong and healthy and well-fed going in, so I didn't die. But I do remember being at the clinic, as many beds as there are, it's as big as this room, and just people lying there shivering. And my main thought as I watched them was, how unfair is this, It's 150 million people or so in Bangladesh, so half our population. But when you try to measure how much carbon they emit, the UN does this in the off chance that someday we might want to actually reduce it, you can't even get a number for Bangladesh. It's a rounding error in the calculation. Nobody has a car, Most aren't connected to the electric grid. So, it was a reminder that this is not only a huge practical dilemma, but an enormous moral one, too. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so every once in a while I think about those sort of things. And when I got home, it just seemed like writing and talking about it wasn't enough. But what to do? I had no idea. I live up in the woods in Vermont, so I called a couple of my other writer friends on the phone and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up to Burlington, which is our main city. It's only about 50,000 people, so it's not really that main, but it's what we've got, And we're going to sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll get arrested, and there'll be a little story in the paper. It'll be, we will have done something. And these other writers were as clueless as, oh, that's a good plan. Let's do that, Happily, one of them called up the police in Burlington. What will happen should we carry out this intrepid stunt, And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, And so I was, like, damn. So I sent out an email. We're change of plans. We're going to go for a walk. And we left a couple of weeks later from Robert Frost's old summer riding cabin up in the Green Mountains. He's kind of our patron saint, And we walked for 5 days and slept in farm fields. And, the Methodists en route had all arranged potluck suppers. The kind of Methodist sacrament, was there for us to partake. And we finally get to Burlington, and there's 1,000 people walking. Now, most of you guys are from sophisticated metropolises, but in Vermont, 1,000 people in one place, with the exception of UVM hockey games, that's as many as you get, And all our politicians who are all running, this was 2006, so they're all running for Congress and Senate. They all come down to meet with us, and they all sign up to be strong. Even the woman who had the Republican ticket, who almost won our congressional seat, she had said 2 months before, I'm not sure global warming is real. More research needs to be done. Which in passing at the moment would be a remarkably progressive position in the Republican Party. But, it turned out that the more research that needed to be done was on the topic, how many people will walk across Vermont, and ask me to change my mind, And empirically, 1,000 was sufficient because she signed up, So that was good. That's how it's supposed to work. What was terrible was to open the paper the next day and read this story that said that those 1,000 people were probably the biggest demonstration that had yet taken place in the U.S. about climate change. When I read that, I thought, no wonder we lose. We've got the superstructure of a movement. We've got political leaders like Senator Wirth. We've got economists and policy people and scientists. The only part of the movement we forgot was the movement part. There's nothing there to give it any heft, so we better figure out how to do it. And when I say we, when we started a few months later to try and build this global movement, the we was me and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College, 7 seniors. So they were they weren't like done with school, but they were done with school and ready to go, and that was good. And we thought, we weren't smart enough to know that our problem was that we had no money or no organization or anything. We thought that our biggest problem was, how do you organize the globe when everybody speaks a different language? And that's why we came up with this odd name for this operation, 350.org. Jim Hansen, our most important climatologist, put out a paper in December of '07, said, we now know enough about climate to know how much carbon is too much. Any value greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. It's a pretty strong language. Stronger still when you know that, last week, researchers in the Arctic reported for the first time in 800,000 years, CO2 concentrations on this planet have begun to nose above the 400 parts per million mark, okay? So that's bad news, really bad news. It means we're not going to stop global warming. It means at best we're going to keep it from being worse than it absolutely has to. But for us as organizers, we were suddenly seized with the notion that though you would not normally choose a wonky scientific data point from which to operate, that in fact Arabic numerals would be our friend because they skip lightly across those linguistic boundaries, where words can't really travel. And so we named this thing 350.org, and we set out to see what we could do to spread the word. As I say, it was a kind of ludicrous proposition, but there were 7 of them, and there are 7 continents, so that was a good match. Each one took one. The guy who got the Antarctic also had to take the internet, and, off we set to work. And our work was to find other people like ourselves around the world. And there's not every place a kind of category called environmentalist, but every place there's someone who's worried about hunger, about women's issues, about war and peace, about public health, about development generally, about all the things you can't do when your planet is disintegrating, about all the things no one's working on in Thailand right now because they're just trying to sort of dry people out and, shovel out the mud. And those were the kind of people we started finding all over the world, mostly young, partly because our crew was mostly young. We did these training camps for young people in, one in Turkey for Central Asia, and one in the Caribbean, one in Johannesburg, where we brought a couple of kids from each country in Africa. Most had never been on an airplane or left their home country, but they were great organizers. And we told everybody, we're going to try to just take one day to start this. And then we picked a day sort of arbitrarily in the fall of 2009. I think it was October 24th. And said, everybody do something on that day. And we had no idea how it would go. But we began to get the sense it might work 2 days early when we got a phone call. We were sitting around our little borrowed office, the 8 of us in a room in Lower Manhattan, around a table with our laptops open. And the phone rang, and it was from our leader in Ethiopia, a 17-year-old girl named Wow. And she was in tears, and she said, the government has taken away our permit for Saturday. We're going to do it today before they can stop us, which was a brave thing to do. But the reason she was crying, really, she just kept saying, we don't want to spoil it for everybody else, and we don't want to jump the gun, and we were so looking forward to doing it with everybody else. We're really sorry, and we have 15,000 young people out in the street right now in Addis. And if I can get this slides to work, I'll even show you those guys. Do we know if the slides are working? There we go. There they are in Addis, all happily. And it was really quite remarkable. For the next 72 hours, these pictures just came in from all over the place. The next one was U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Slow down for a second there. They made a 350 with sandbags and sent us a note saying, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking. Do the next one there. The thing I really want you to see, though, is what your brothers and sisters in this work around the world look like. Because I have heard too many times this notion that environmentalism is something for rich white people, and that if you worried where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be a part of any of this or things. And it's just not true. Most of the people we work with around the world are poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is composed of. And oddly enough, we can do one more here. And one more. Oddly enough, they're just as interested in the future as anybody else, maybe more so, because the future bears down hard on you in those places. Actually, go back a couple there. That's a very funny one, but go back a couple. You know, that's someplace on the Congo River above Kinshasa. That's where Conrad, in his Eurocentric way, you know, identified the sort of heart of darkness on our planet. They're obviously not rich. They didn't have a digital camera. Those are dugout canoes. They developed it in their home darkroom. It didn't come out so well, so they wrote in what their banner had said. But there they were, you know, taking part and all over the place. So let's just flip through quickly some of these here. I'll tell you when we need to stop there. And there really were a lot of beautiful, creative things. Keep going. And wonderful involvement of religious communities. There's the head of Muslim South Africa, of indigenous traditions. Behind him, Archbishop Tutu's successor, an Anglican archbishop, at the head of a huge multi-faith march. Great involvement of religious communities. Next. That's the biggest evangelical college in the country, and so it was Billy Graham's alma mater. Next. Stop there for a sec. I'd been to Bethlehem to do some organizing. Not an easy place to get to, but the Dead Sea has shrunk about 26 meters in the last 40 years, partly because of the rise in temperatures. They wanted to do something. Too many military checkpoints in the way, so the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5, and the Israelis said, we'll take care of the 0. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day. 300 big demonstrations across China. Not an easy place to do this, but, you know, they were really involved. Next. And, you know, there are our friends in the Maldives, paradise, you know. 5,000-year-old culture there in the islands in the Indian Ocean. These white sand beaches, coral reefs, coconut palms, entirely Muslim country, incredibly beautiful. They're not going to be a 5,100-year-old culture, probably, because the highest point in the archipelago is about 1.5 meters above sea level. And there is nothing, obviously, they can do to stop it except to appeal to the rest of us. And on we go. And, it was a huge success, you know, in terms of media coverage. Go one more there. I think in large part because, you can go ahead one. Editors were surprised at what people looked like, you know. There's that 0 is all women in full black burqa, okay? They don't look to us like the Sierra Club, but in fact, their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're selfless, they're thinking about the future, they're trying to imagine what kind of world they can build for their... It was remarkable. Next. There's the world's largest solar array on the sand in the United Arab Emirates. These guys are oil-rich sheikhs, but they plan on staying rich no matter what, you know, which is a lesson perhaps for us. Next. And there were 400 or 500 pictures that ended up in a file just called 350 Adorable. And they were adorable. Let's see the next one there. And the next one. But they were also very sad, too. And there's a reasonable chance that those girls will be refugees in the course of their lives and not through any fault of their own. This was a big success. There were 5,100 of these demonstrations over that weekend in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. It was pretty neat. And we've gone on to do a lot more like it, this sort of educational stuff all over the world. And now really pretty much every country that there is, except, as Senator Worth noted, North Korea, where we've made no great effort to participate. It's been remarkable to get to see this word spread and to see how well it's spread in so many parts of the world. There is no question that the United States is the most recalcitrant, skeptical, and difficult country in the world about climate change, which makes sense because we're more deeply addicted to fossil fuel than any other place, and addiction is often accompanied by that kind of deep denial, you know. So we're having to fight hard. Not just do education, but do a certain amount of confrontation, too. And more all the time. That's what movements have to do sometimes. And in the last year, it's been about this Keystone Pipeline. I don't know, it's going to be a little hard, I think, to skip ahead to all these. It's going to take too long to go through all these many pictures to get there. Well, you can flip through some of them, and I'll tell you when to stop. Knowing that you'll hear nothing I say because you're watching the pictures, but that's all right. Just keep flipping through, please. This Keystone Pipeline, which no one had heard about a year ago right now, almost no one, because I'd never heard of it. Jim Hansen, again, was the guy who blew the whistle. And he said, you should pay some attention because those tar sands up in Canada, where that stuff's coming from, are the second largest pool of carbon on Earth, okay? And if you could burn it all overnight, which thank God you can't, but if you could, there's enough carbon up there that you would run the temperature of you'd run the atmospheric concentration of CO2 from 400 parts per million to 540 parts per million overnight, okay? So it's a big deal. You should do something about it. And I had no idea what to do about it, but I knew that we needed to draw some attention to it. So I figured one way to do it, perhaps, would be through the use of civil disobedience, something that we haven't done a lot of in the environmental movement in a long time. So we wrote a letter. I wrote it, and a bunch of my friends signed on to it, including Gus, who's here tonight. Okay, one more, I think. Yeah, stop right there. And we asked people. Wendell Berry signed it, and some of the indigenous leaders who'd really carried this fight from the beginning and things. And we said, come to Washington and get arrested. We did not know if people would show up. We said we're going to do it over 2 weeks. And the first day, there were 80 people there, which was a lot more than we'd expected, and a lot more than the police had expected. They're used to dealing with people by their 2s and 3s, and they're pretty good at the procedure is always the same. They just arrest them and handcuff them and take them away to the station and fine them $100 and release them. But when they saw our 80 people and knew that we were going to be there for 2 weeks, the sergeant said, we're going to try and deter you because we don't really want to deal with this. And so the first batch of us got to spend 3 days in Central Cell Block in D.C. And it was, it was, as Gus will attest, fairly basic. Actually kind of retro in a lot of ways, It hadn't occurred to me that they still shackled everybody at the ankle and made you walk around with your, hand on the shoulder of the guy in front of you and so on and so forth. But Gus was right through the next cell, and he actually, one of the high points of the whole thing was Gus Speth giving a kind of half-hour lecture about the subject of his new book to everybody in the cell block, which was really great. And partway through, you can show a couple more of these pictures here of just people getting arrested. Partway through, Gus, there I am. Partway through, okay, stop there. Gus's son, who's a high-powered lawyer, he was the only person who could actually get in to visit us, and he managed to get in, and so Gus could smuggle out a note to the press, and his question was, what should he say? And he came up, I thought, with something very powerful. He'd been dean at Yale, he'd been head of the UN Development Program, he'd been chair of the President's Council on Environmental Quality. His note said, I've held a lot of important positions in this town, but none seem as important as the one I'm in right now, And that was a very powerful thing to say. And I know that there are at least a couple other people in this room tonight who got arrested with us there. Would you guys stand up for a second? Those who were in there for that fight, there you are. Thank you all so much. It had its intended effect. Suddenly people knew about this thing, and then it became a political issue, and we followed the president around the country very politely. Every place he went, they were greeted by lots and lots of students and people, and they'd be chanting, yes, we can, stop the pipeline. And it was great. And we came back to the White House, and we did indeed circle it 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder around that mile-wide perimeter. And every sign that we carried was just a quote from Barack Obama in 2008. Time to end the tyranny of oil. In my administration, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow. We kind of called on him to make good on his word in this case, and he did, at least in part. 4 days later, 4 days later, he said, we're going to delay this for a year and take a real look at it, which was a brave thing to do because the American Petroleum Institute, a.k.a. Big Oil, had said there will be huge political consequences, and they have the money to make that threat stick, and they have done so. They've spent probably $100 million running ads at them all the time. In fact, Mitt Romney last week, in the first ad of the general election, he said, my first action on taking office will be to approve the Keystone Pipeline, okay? So that was interesting. I mean, I don't know whether it's for the better or for worse or whatever, but at the very least, we demonstrated, all of us, that you could take an issue and put it into the public eye and make it stick. And that kind of movement building is really important, and it's really important for the work that we're all about at NEI. One of the lessons about how we did it, of course, is that we make good use of the tools at our availability that we didn't have even a little while. You can go on from that bad picture, yeah, and just here's some of the other people who were the biggest demonstration, civil disobedience in Canada in many, many years, and it happened right afterward. And around the world, all this going on, and you can see some of these other pictures from around the country, and then back in Washington for these big marches and things. You can just stop right there. That we have these technologies at our disposal, the ability to use Twitter and Flickr and email and the web and things are great helps. They are no substitute, as you can tell, for also getting people out in the flesh. You have to use them to build that real world presence, and so we do. That's how people communicate now, especially younger people, and it's really beautiful to see what's possible, that one can be immediately linked up with people in the poorest parts of the world, because everybody's got a cell phone now, and you can put it to real use. But the other lesson for me, watching all this, was that we're not actually going to beat global warming one pipeline at a time. Important as this work is, we have to figure out how to go deeper and harder into the center of that economy and into the center of the fossil fuel industry and really fight it. So this summer, and this is work that we need your help with every place around the country, this summer the project is to end the direct subsidy that the federal government gives each year to the fossil fuel industry. This is, even if they were not destroying the planet, this would be obnoxious, okay? They are the richest industry on Earth, and we have lots of other things to which we could put that money to much better use. And it just is a ludicrous proposition to begin with. You give subsidies to things that you don't know how to do yet. You give someone a grant, you should, to help them go to college so they can learn things and come out the better for it. But we've known how to burn coal for 300 years, This is like giving someone a scholarship to get their 40th bachelor's degree, okay? At a certain point, you just pay yourself, It makes no sense. So, happily, my senator, Bernie Sanders, and Keith Ellison of Minnesota in the House introduced a bill 2 weeks ago that will take $113 billion over the next 10 years from the fossil fuel industry and use it for other things. And we can actually win this fight, because it turns out that 70% of Republicans and 70% of independents and 70% of Democrats all hate fossil fuel subsidies. 2% of Americans strongly support them. Okay, which I think gives you the exact number of how many fossil fuel executives and lobbyists there are in this country. we can win this fight, but it's going to take a lot of hard work, and it's going to require the kind of decentralized actions that join together of the kind I've been showing you today. If you go to the 350.org website, and I hope you will, so you can keep track of this climate fight in the months and years ahead, you'll see that yesterday, Crew unveiled this quite fascinating and interesting scoreboard, electronic scoreboard that it has every member of Congress, and there's a sort of space for figuring out, calling them and getting their position, and then you can enter it in, and we can keep track, and in innovative ways. You can take your cell phone with its ability to take movies, and at your next town hall with your representative, you can say, would you support getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies? And if he says yes or he says no, you can capture the answer and then upload this to this scoreboard so that everybody can see it. And we can start to pin these guys down and put them on the record. And once we've done that, then we're going to try and shame them, okay, the ones who won't go along. Because if you're going to take money from the fossil fuel industry and then give them presents, if you're going to take their money, then you should be proud of it, You should be, when they're NASCAR drivers, they wear their allegiance on their sleeve, like literally, okay? They're proud to be, racing for, if there's Kentucky Fried Chicken, they put a big chicken on the front of the car, They're pleased with it. We're got hold of a couple of hundred blue blazers, and we're doctoring them up with all the logos that go with this, and as the summer goes on, we're going to be presenting them to the, you're going to go on the floor of the House, but then you should wear your suit. The power of money, the power of the economy, the power of this economy that we've built to wreck our planet demands that we be willing to take this kind of action. And I'm going to end here by saying just two more things. One is that I don't know how it all comes out. I have no idea. We may have waited too long to get started, and there may be too much money on the other side. We don't know. We won't know. This is not like, the civil rights movement, where Dr. King would say at the end of every speech, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It may take a while, but we're going to win. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat, and we're losing fast, okay? Today, we learned that this spring has been the warmest spring ever recorded and the most extreme season ever recorded in the United States. By a large measure, it crushed all the other records. Yesterday, we learned that in Saudi Arabia they had the hottest rainstorm ever recorded on our planet. It was 109 degrees, and it somehow managed to rain. It shouldn't physically be possible. We didn't think it was, but there's so much moisture now in the atmosphere that it is. We're building a science fiction story here, and we're building it fast, and I don't know whether we can stop it. But if we can, and if we can build this new economy, it will depend in part on our ability to get one really key thing across. And that thing is that we are not radicals in any way, or extremists, or militants, or anything else. When we told people to come to Washington to get arrested, we told them two things. One, young people should not have to be the cannon fodder here, okay? If you're 22 right now in our economy, you don't need an arrest record, all right? One of the few privileges of growing older is that past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, And so it was real good. We didn't ask people, how old are you? Because that would be rude. But we did say, who was president when you were born? Okay? And the two biggest cohorts getting arrested had been born in the FDR and the Truman administrations. Okay? So that was... And along with that, the other thing that we told people was, if you're coming to Washington to get arrested, would you please put on a necktie or a dress? Okay? As you can tell, I'm not sort of big on formal wear and things, but we wanted to make that point about radicalism. We're not in any way, all we're asking for is a world that works the way the one we were born on works. That's not radical. If anything, that's conservative. Radicals work at oil companies. If you are willing to make your fortune, and they are very large fortunes, by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, then you are engaged in an act more radical than humans have engaged in the past, okay? It is the most radical thing one could contemplate doing, and it needs to be called out all the time. What we're talking about here, whether it's stopping climate change or the allied cause of building human-scale economies that work for human beings, aren't radical in any way. They draw very much on the past that we come out of, and they respond to that by imagining a future that takes advantage of the tools of the present, but that works for who we are and what we are. That's what it's got to be about. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a kind of hotbed of that radicalism, they filed a brief a couple of years ago with the EPA, encouraging them not to take any action on climate change. And one of the things it said in the brief was, even if it's somehow the scientists are all the scientists are right and it warms up, it won't be a problem because human beings will adapt their behavior and physiology to cope with this new world. Not that their members might consider adapting their business plan, to deal with the sun and the wind. No, it would be better for us to adapt our physiology. I don't even know what that means. I mean, gills, I don't know. But the sheer radicalism of that should kind of put us on notice. I don't know if we're going to win this fight. I do know, because I've been all over the world, that every place there are people now, and especially often in places that haven't caused the problem, there are people eager to do something about it. It's always a great honor to be in those rooms, but boy, I can't think of any room I've been in a long time that it's more of an honor for me to get to be in than this one. Thank you guys so much for what you, thank you for what you've already done, and we will fight this on together. Take care.